Hey, so welcome everybody. Super excited to see see everybody joining for this talk and to see some familiar faces, folks returning who have been to previous talks. Just for a little bit of context, your Future Sketches is a group at MIT Media Lab. We're looking at kind of what are tools that artists and designers will be using in the future and exploring that space, building all kinds of artifacts and experimental tools and so on. And this field of generative AI is one that we've been, we've just been seeing things bubbling up, and the space has been going pretty, it's felt really chaotic in the last half year or so. And so we just wanted to invite people to come in and speak about it. I'm going to pass it off to Vera to can give some context for the speaker series and introduce our speaker today. But I just want to say again, we're super excited to have you here. If you have questions or any comments, feel free to add them in the chat. Would love even if you can just take a moment and put a message in the chat of where you're calling in from or anything. That would be awesome to see where everybody is coming from. And I'm going to pass it to Vera.
Thanks, Zach. Welcome everyone. Thanks for being here at the last lecture in this lecture series about generative AI and artistic practice. So Zach already said a little bit about it. There's been this crazy development in the field of generative AI, and we in the group really felt a bit overwhelmed by it. And we've been having a lot of conversations about it, and we thought that this was like an interesting thing for a larger community than just our group. So that's why we decided to host this lecture series. And we wanted to really focus on how people with an artistic or design practice approach this whole change or these techniques and how they engage with it, and maybe also what ethical implications are that they're worried about or that they're addressing. And maybe on the more positive sides, if there's holistic means or like ways of co-creation with techniques like this. So that's kind of the outline of the program. And we're really, really excited today to have David Rudnick with us. So David is a self-taught graphic designer who studied art history and philosophy at Yale, and now is exploring his relationship with visual communication, but also language or memory, and has a ton of different media that he works in, like type design, printed matter, video, and also web design. And he's now speaking from Ghent, where he has a studio called The Rain. So please give him a warm welcome. You can clap with this emoji or you can unmute. And we're really excited to hear from you.
Thanks so much. Thank you, everyone. Hi there. Thank you to MIT and to Zach and Vera for having me join the talk today and to meet with you all. And it's amazing to see you already in the chat, everyone tuning in from all these wonderful different places. The first thing I should say is that I will try and talk about a few different things today, and then I want to leave a bit of time perhaps for a chance to have some discussion or conversation, or to raise some questions, or to hear some input from some of the people in the audience, in that these technologies, the paradigms, the ways that they're affecting our work and practices, the possibilities that they contain it's a phenomenal moment of emergence. And the speed of that emergence, I think, is quite remarkable. But I think we are at a point where no matter if you're extremely proficient or involved on an engineering level with some of these technologies, or you're just approaching them purely from a consumer or even as a viewer, the world around us is changing very rapidly, I think, to degrees that are very novel, hard to quantify with kind of the speed at which technology or culture had maybe evolved in the years prior. And I think that is a trend which is only going to continue to accelerate through the weeks and months ahead. So I'm going to share some of my perspectives on these things, but I also think now is an important time for people from all different aspects of the communities with whom who have making practices in visual culture, who interact with culture on a daily life that includes generated content or content that could potentially be generated, to talk to one another at times like this, because I think that this really is our opportunity for dialogue, because we're seeing emergent norms or kind of product uses or even potentially ethical questions emerge, which we are in the, I think, fortunate moment yet where all of the answers aren't yet locked in to how those things are going to define and determine the coming years and of our practices and lives. But now is definitely the time for us to dive into these things. So a little bit about me. I'll give a little bit of framing, and then I'll try and outline some of the ways in which these technologies have already interacted with the processes that we work with in the studio and in my practice. And then I want to talk a little bit about how some of my personal thoughts, concerns for the ways in which the second order, third order, fourth order impacts of the presence of these tools, or some of the norms or defaults that they may create, also potentially will affect making, viewing, and the space that we all potentially share that we would previously have called the space of visual culture in the time to come. So I'm David Rudnick, as Vera said. I run a studio here in Ghent in Belgium called Terrain. And Terrain's practice is quite visually omnivorous in the sense that we work predominantly within the space of graphic design. And I call myself a graphic designer. Generate visual systems at the studio, which tends to, at their heart, have visual components, typographic components, image components, symbol components, kind of hierarchies, typologies, which are used for graphic purposes. But I think one of the ways in which we frame the practice here at the studio, and I think the fundamental that we try and view as an important component of the approach that we make, is that we are making materials that are going to be components of communication. And so we're always trying to think about the impact that they will have on the viewer and how they will remain in the world and what their presence will be as an extant system. And a decision which I would categorize potentially as an ethical or moral one that I have made in our practice is that we view it as an important component of the way that we approach graphic design, even down to client selection or how we frame an approach to a topic, that we want to build systems which can have, the goal is to explore the idea of what systems might look like with the longest possible footprint of utility for a viewer, and to consider this as a component of how we think about both the system and the again, like kind of the selection of what we might want to work on in the studio. And that framing leads itself naturally to us being particularly interested in two areas of visual production. The first would be the area that you would largely determine as cultural production, which is a space where individuals who are not the studio are making cultural work that they themselves that might have a long lifespan of impact because of its artistic merit or because of its expressive merit. So working with musicians, filmmakers, artists, videographers, script writers, etc., publishing books, whereby the content is potentially going to be accessed years and years and years from now in the same form in which we publish it, or framed by some of the visual motifs or devices that we create as entry points for the viewer. So, I mean, we're all familiar with albums from 20, 30, 40 years ago that may have had impacts on our life, or films, etc. We think if you use that metric again of like visual systems and looking at the footprint of the length of time of their utility, therefore, that something like the titles of a film or the way that album art works, therefore, actually becomes valuable as a cultural commodity in a way that doesn't closely align to currently its commercial or economic value. And so we do prioritize that work. The obvious thing to say is that its commercial or economic value in the current consumer milieu is low, and that these are areas of culture that have had their funding and kind of budgets massively impacted by some of the developments of media architecture, platform architecture over the last 10 or 20 years. And so we approach these projects as well, knowing that they will not be revenue generating necessarily for the studio, but it's important that we use them as a space to explore visual systems that we think can have long lifespans of use. And then on the flip side of this is we view it as the remit of the studio also to explore the idea of generating novel systems, whether they are completely sui generis, generated internally as studio projects, or with partners where we are building either identities or products that we think can have lasting value. And that these are the two kinds of work that Terrain works on. We call ourselves a graphic design studio, but we don't do campaigns. We don't do content that is ephemeral, and we try not to work with platforms where the content cannot last. So I will talk a little bit later about Spotify in the talk because of some of the interesting products that they announced over the last 24 hours, which I think are relevant to some of the topics that we can cover today. But we are seeing a narrowing of the spaces within everyday life, within shared culture, within the space that forms the repository of language, image, symbols, which we might be able to access communally, recognize and form relationships with, that we can share with other people, that are being fundamentally having the capacity for lasting content to be put into them, or content that isn't dynamically, morphologically changing at the behest of the platform, narrow and diminished to the point where these are now becoming, I think, increasingly luxury experiences in everyday life. And I think one thing that I want to bring into the framing as we now move into like kind of looking at some work and talking about these technologies is to say to people who have practices that work with both AI-driven or language model systems or generative systems, to maybe also think about making that distinction in their own practice, or again in like kind of project selection, whereby are the dynamic aspects going to remain over time parameters that you can control, that you can reliably confer to a viewer as well, and therefore preserve the generative component of the project as one that might have meaning? Or are the generative or dynamic aspects of the platform being held by a third party or controlled by a framing that you don't personally access as part of the creation, which may mean that you are ultimately creating content that could be removed, obfuscated, changed by a system that would ultimately deprive the viewer of access to it down the line. I'm going to just scroll up on this tab that I have open here, just to say that what you're seeing on the screen right now are just some examples of work from the studio. I'm not going to go into detail and do a portfolio review of any of these things that you're going to see. I'm going to scroll through them reasonably quickly because I'm going to get up to some of the more recent work. But one thing you will see here is that visually the work that the studio does is reasonably disparate, with certain components it usually has in common. The most important one is that when we approach any project that we do here, we want to attune ourselves to the specificity of that client brief or opportunity and its audience, to try and see if it's possible to generate a novel and specific visual system which will remain unique to the fundamentals that are unique of that viewing experience. So for an album, often I will create a new typeface for the album, or for a client platform, or for an identity. I'll create a new potentially symbolic language. I'll try and we'll work in the studio to create systems where all of these things are generated in concert to be as simple as possible, but never forbidding the use of potentially arcane or outre or non-contemporary looking components, in that if they are able to create a coherent individual system that creates a unique and memorable and repeatable and lasting response, then those options should be on the table. Again, if you think about the footprint of time and the idea of survival of visual systems, something looking radically contemporary is not necessarily a good strategy for ensuring its long-term survival, because that aesthetic will age. Or if you do something which is strongly paired to state-of-the-art technology or state-of-the-art moments, when that technology is no longer state-of-the-art, it then no longer has the same meaning, and it certainly doesn't have the same freshness. So a lot of what we do is this quite arcane, I guess, drawing from my background in art history, just a capacity that I think from personal analysis or observation, systems which tend to survive are those which are uniquely tailored to their specific instance of meaning, rather than the time in which they emerged. And that's, I think, part of the reason why when we started using some of these new tools and technologies here in the studio, and I'll stop here and I'll talk a bit about how we've used some of them, the interest is very much in trying to at least see if it's possible to remain kind of somewhat distant from them, as they are spectacularly powerful and incredibly interesting things to use, but also trying to remain some sort of position of an observer even from our own operations of them, trying to understand when this technology is quotidian or 100 times more powerful than it is now, what are the things that we can generate with it as a result of this system, which would still remain part of it. The image on screen right now is an album cover for a band called Black Midi, who are a British experimental rock band. They're fantastic. I really recommend their work. This is from 2021, early 2021. This is a record called Cavalcade. And this, I believe, is, I think, the first album cover by any artist, first published album cover that used Midjourney. Now it's going to be incredibly commonplace to have AI art on album covers, but this was, I think, the first one that was publicly used, and that I was part of a very, very early beta of the technology. And one thing that I'd done with Black Midi in the past, this is a very, very banal thing, but it's really, really simple. Like my work with the band had always involved, their work is this extreme bricolage of virtuosic different styles, and it's very kind of ranging from the psychedelic to the grotesque, but it's chaotic. And I, always working with the band, had worked with collage as a medium, as a way of manifesting the just the texture and experience of listening to a song by the band. For the first album, I did that and used a bunch of scans and reinterpretations of images from the things from the archive here in the studio. And a very straightforward piece of feedback I got from record label was, for the second album, can you not do that? Because you create an absolute nightmare for our legal department putting 700 images on your album cover, even if they're in various states of distortion. Can you work with royalty-free imagery for the second record? It goes without saying that the solution to that, synthesizing the images through Midjourney and then cutting those up and creating collages from images that had no previous author or precedent, is kind of, on one hand, a potentially very liberating thing for a creator, where suddenly you are deprived of the notion of the source. But as anyone who knows the process of training a large language model, that's a kind of false liberation, in that these images do have sources. Those sources would have been copyright protected, but they are obfuscated by the fact that they have been semantically interpreted by this model and now come out in a form which certainly cannot be like legally bullseyed to being like, okay, we can see that like this model was trained on this copyrighted image or that. And as long as I don't use anyone's names in the prompts or terms which legally would be, like kind of demanding that it do things which are obviously sticky. And this is all saying, of course, that all of these things are, when it comes to what the final laws on them are, very much in the process of being manifested. But I think we have here this kind of, it was my first awakening and realization of like, wow, this is amazing, and then also very complex in terms of the problems it creates, completely original problems for how visual culture relates to itself, how visual culture like understands the future of things like sampling, originality, plagiarism, etc. I want to make a really, really simple point here. which those of you who have generative practices, or I think like one thing which maybe gets glossed over very, very quickly in the current presentations of how synthetic image software or synthetic image programs, like kind of how they interact with the current design workflow, in that there's a lot of, I think like they're kind of placed as a replacement for the creator potentially, and a replacement also for the primary tool. I think that there's of course many ways, and we'll go on to talk about them today, where they can function in that way. But I think one interesting fundamental change which they put on the table, which I haven't seen clearly articulated yet, is they bring to light, exactly because of, I guess, this same problem here, the way in which a process already had a kind of tripartite structure for a creator, where in the middle of the process, and this is the part that we normally focus on, there is direct access to the creation by the creator through an editing tool. But if I was going to go A, B, C to the point of the viewer seeing the final product, and the editing tool is part B of this process, A is either the generation of original material via code, via capture through a device like a camera, via, you know, like input from the creator directly, drawing on paper, writing, etc. B is the formatting component, which actually had come to become the framing of what the design practice was. And then C is the publishing. But as those of you who work more directly, maybe generating imagery content directly out of code, or writers would be much more familiar with, actually this part, which is maybe sometimes framed as an artistic practice, it's sometimes framed as an engineering practice, but it's less seen as part of the design practice, is the synthesis of the material to be edited. This is also the juncture at which currently the law places a lot of its operations, the gap between A and B. Did you synthesize the material that you are editing? This is also part of currently the legal framing of like how we view where transgressions in the creative flow may currently exist. And I think it's useful to say that what these tools do is they don't fundamentally change the model that we have of production. They add a new mode of synthesis in part A, much less than they currently add editing tools in part B. I would still take this image out of the tool into Photoshop, edit it, compose it, and then it will be published and visible to an audience in the same way that anyone who's worked with Midjourney or a large language model. It is a new camera. It is a new mode of it's a new browser window. It's a new terminal tab potentially in these processes, more than it is the kind of like editing suite or the DaVinci Resolve terminal. But we are in the gap right now, and we won't be for much longer, where the language model will be integrated into part B. We've probably got 8 to 9 months, maybe, maybe a year. The next wave of operating systems, of the core of the Adobe suite, of like kind of these editing tools for people who are involved, at a much less professional level as well, will have the prompts and the models built into those interfaces. And I want to jump across a couple of tabs right now. Actually, I think I'd like to just jump straight across to Spotify, if I'm honest, to talk about what I think on a far more conceptual and practical level, I think the impact of these models is, as creators, I think we're always concerned about what will it change about our creative process. But I think we are starting to see the results now of what happens to larger macro social processes when synthetic generation is incorporated into the ABC process rather than just the A. When you're able to build software platforms where content can be recuperated and fed back into a model, and generated content can be propagated by the platform as well. And I think today's announcement by Spotify of what the future of their platform was a really just interesting kind of like first indicator of where I think a few of these models are headed. So just jump across a couple of tabs. I think I might have to select into the browser window. Sorry, 1 second. Sorry, guys. Oh, sorry. I'm trying to click between tabs here. I'm just going to exit full screen and manually tab across. Just bear with me. This is from today's Spotify presentation, or yesterday's Spotify presentation that Daniel Ek triumphantly shared with. Let's go back. Can you all hear the audio on this tab? I think one thing that's not unrelated, not tangential to what I'm going to talk about when I talk about the platform is the fact that it seems to me pretty clear that that audio is probably, at least in part, but I would imagine close to wholly, synthesized in-house. These sound a lot like short samples that one might be able to generate, again, royalty-free from a model, paired with some very generic beats and loops. Spotify portray themselves as a music provider, a platform that allows their audience to access music. It's, I think, a really significant shot across the bows of what a user might think music is, for you to announce an evolution of the platform that doesn't actually present something that a user might recognize as a culturally visible piece of music. Instead, it is audio content to support visually driven narrative, this advertisement. It's, I think, a quite deliberate choice on behalf of Spotify, because what this platform that they are building shows is the future of how they view the content that they provide. They are moving away from being a model in which the viewer accesses what would have been in the previous cultural model, something that we call music. And instead, it will be a mix of content, audio content like audiobooks, as you can see here, short videos, video clips, promotional material from artists that will be served to the viewer in a continuous scrolling feed, much like TikTok. That feed will obviously be unique to every user and will be both algorithmically informed by that user's preferences and probably as well kind of trained based on the responses that they have to understand the types of content that might affect them or users like them. I want to quickly jump across to, like, I prepared a very, very quick diagram here to just explain why. I know it might seem like a bit of an aside that I'm talking about Spotify right now and I'm talking about a platform, but one of the things which I think is really, really important when we talk about the impact of what generative models can do at scale is, as users, we can have, you know, the indulgence or fun of being like, wow, look, I can make any image that I wanted or whatever. That's exciting to me as an artist, but I think we're missing the bigger picture that huge parts of our cultural model right now are determined and dominated by services that provide that content to an audience that is captive inside of their service, that can only get that type of content from that service or a very small number of competitors. If your access to music in your life is probably gated heavily at this point through 3 or 4 apps. Spotify, maybe YouTube, possibly TikTok. That is where you would encounter or discover new music in your life. If one of them changes their discovery model, it will obviously impact that heavily. But more than that, if these tools are available at scale to the people who control your access to the music, then the obvious thing to say is that a very quick analysis of what their product is suggests that these tools will start to be used by the platform themselves very quickly. I have here a little diagram, right? This is like the current model of something like Spotify, but it could also be Netflix. You have at the top some creators, artists, musicians, filmmakers, etc., and they're making content. And the platform is accessing that content. Maybe it's paying them to make the content, which has costs. Maybe they're providing it to the platform for free because they want to reach the audience. And then we have down the bottom, the platform provides the viewers this created content, which they pay a subscription fee in order to access. And from that subscription fee, the platform incurs some costs having to pay back royalties to the creators for people who are watching the content. And this is the current model. I think Daniel Ek and his Spotify executives are sitting around in their offices, or at least definitely have been over the past 3 years, and like, this model doesn't really work very well for us. Every time a viewer wants to listen to some music, it costs us money. That's bad, because if the only service we provide on our platform is providing music, then basically music is something which costs us money. Spotify doesn't like music. In fact, music's a problem to Spotify. They're not in the business of encouraging you to listen to music. That's how Spotify loses money. They don't gain any revenue by you listening to music, they lose it. They only gain revenue from your subscriptions, or if you click about in the app and happen to go to an advertiser service or some kind of ancillary revenue generator. So step 2 with the new feed, change the model. Now you can put people inside a space where you have a feed that controls what they discover. And into that feed, you have the potential to place creator content. But what if there was an optimal version of this model where you could actually just place content you synthesized yourself into this feed? Now, if we reach the point, and I imagine, given that Spotify are using what sounds like AI-generated music in their commercial to announce this, that they think they've probably reached that point, that normal human listeners don't care about the difference between the synthetic content or previously artistically generated content, and don't consider it to have any more cultural value or utility. And you can trap them inside a viewing space where they only see the content that you want them to see. Then if you generate the content synthetically, you gain their subscription fees and you don't have to pay any royalties to your artists. Your costs go down, your revenue goes up. Daniel Ek triumphantly stands on stage in front of 3,000 Spotify shareholders and gets a big round of applause. And the creators up here get no revenue or view, so we have to say bye-bye to them. Sorry, goodbye, creators. It's time for you to leave the model. Obviously, this is something which I think none of us who are particular fans of what we call music or the cultural economy that surrounds it are excited to see happen. But the important thing to say, and this is something I mentioned on Twitter earlier, is that we are an aging, boomerizing audience that are moving out, like, that are not really of great concern to Spotify in some sense, in that a 10-year-old or an 11-year-old who accesses the platform now has no previous experience to model or no default by which to understand that the music that they access is interesting because it has all of these legacy cultural attachments, like subcultures that you might participate in order to access it. They're not old enough to go to clubs. They probably can't go to concerts on their own. So if that content was replaced by artists that were fully synthesized, but Spotify completely and entirely owned or had created from scratch, then Spotify would be swallowing massive chunks of the global audience, the revenue that music might create, the intellectual properties that might be associated with it, et cetera, et cetera. I have a third slide here in this model, which is a potential kind of I don't want to be too dystopian or black-pilled, further evolution of this model that I'm not suggesting Spotify will necessarily do this, but what I will say is this: I want to put this image in your heads now, because I do think within the next 18 months, 24 months, you're going to see services emerge that are going to offer this model to the consumer, and they're going to offer it triumphantly. And if you do feel any revulsion or concern about me showing it now, I want you to remember that when these services do emerge, and that hopefully people will still feel that revulsion then, and this won't feel that normal. But the third model, at least in here, the one thing that I've got in the diagram that I'm showing is that the synthetic content is still broadly distributed, in that Spotify gains, through their multiple millions of users, global insights into communities. And at first they attack this in a quite piecemeal, crude fashion. They generate things that maybe in the way that we understand music now might sound like a hit in a category. They can create the next Calvin Harris summer smash for the club, or the track, the TikTok hit that like might spawn a dance that tons and tons of teens might listen to. But if processing power increases to the point where like generation is essentially like kind of limitless and close to free. The models are optimized to the point where the results can be constantly refined and attuned. It will be more amenable to a content provider not to create monoliths that are propagated across massive groups, which is basically very lossy. You are creating the average of thousands of people's taste, but you're not hitting any of those people specifically in ways that make your content a surefire killer app. Let's say you want to dominate the competition and make sure that they only use your music app. The race will be to create content that is hyper-focused and targeted to the individual user. Based on the music that you like, they're going to create extended 15-minute versions that sound a bit like that Boards of Canada track that you listen to a lot when you work, but oh, this one's 40 minutes long, and it just repeats that infinitum because we've noticed that your browser habits kind of line up with this kind of extended use, or that you like to listen to fast techno while you're working, or here's like a fully synthesized 80-minute mix that doesn't have any vocals in it, like exactly the way that you like it, etc., etc., etc. My concern with this, or my thought, I guess, of the future of content, but also of the future of the interpersonal cultural space, the space in which like content and media exists, is that right now, songs, social activities, the fact that these things necessarily are lossy and have to exist between hundreds and thousands of users are what we currently perceive of as their strength. We love it when Ice Spice goes viral because it gives us all something to share and talk about. We create memes, we remix it, etc. If you can remove the public space of reaction, if you can remove the space in which you share, and instead gatekeep the user into an algorithmic feed where they can't translate content out, there is also no need for the content to be social in any way. It can be totally solipsistic. And this means that we have this horrible kind of gaslighting future potentially emerging of a kind of content schizophrenia where you're hearing songs in your head essentially that other people can't hear, where you're seeing content that you can't share with others that only you saw. You have memories that are untranslatable in a cultural context. 10, 20 years from now, the song that you loved growing up isn't something that can be used as a cultural touchstone that unites a generation and represents a moment of shared emotion or political reality. Instead, it's something an algorithm specifically tailored to make sure that it kept your attention in a particular period where retaining user input inside an algorithmic feed was important to maintaining the profit dominancy of the Spotify model. This is something which, when we talk about the role these tools can have for creators, unfortunately, I think we are the aesthetic component of something that will be welded actually at an industrial level in a way that is like kind of propagated direct from the feed to the viewer, where we actually will no longer have an input into the feed when the feed becomes solipsistic. The difference between the public and the solipsistic feed is, I think, an incredibly important emergent front line that AI will help generate, that will come to define, I think, and I hope it's a battle that essentially actors like Spotify don't win. But I also will say that like I'm not hopeful for the fact that very, very powerful versions of this model, I think, are going to be brought to market very, very soon, where the entire cultural space, the value of our work, the reason that we do what we do, but also that we, I think, believe that it can have meaning to an audience, is that we're not producing it just because it's the kind of image we want to see. It is a process of communication where the dialogue, the language is emergent from a creator, but it needs to be received and understood and viewed by viewers. And in terrain sense, we want to see if it's possible, if those viewers can continue to abide over time, rather than focusing on like a hype window or the idea of the now. And this is almost the exact opposite idea, collapsing not just the shared space of the now, the social understanding of us being a body public that has things that are placed into our collective midst, and instead attempting to usurp the body public by installing a rentier platform between us and the public sphere that directly inserts content into our attention space. I hope it is something that is on principle fought back against or rejected, but the problem is the platform primacy of these spaces is so strong. I cannot publish music, in formats that easily circumvent Spotify, that can reach you. There are dwindling spaces like Bandcamp or publishing directly through a public feed on a platform like Twitter. where I can potentially reach a public audience. I would say that the notion of the public versus the solipsistic feed is a front line that needs to be strongly protected and resisted as we move into an age where generative and synthetic tools can populate the feed. I feel that I know which side of the line I stand on, but I'm interested to hear others. I know that I will probably get quite a few comments from people saying to the effect of, this is alarmist, etc. But also, we love music so much. It's such a fundamental part of our life. We love art so much. Those experiences won't die. People will still go to the club, they'll seek it out, etc. You can't take that away from people. We feel that because we've lived it. Our inculcated understanding of what music, of what club culture, of what social spaces are, is intrinsic and important to how we came to model who we see ourselves to be. If you are 5 years old right now, if you're 6 years old right now, if your dominant social spaces, if your sense of self, if your sense of identity are generated through forced solipsistic platforms, you will not have those relationships to what we view as intercultural media. And so I think, like, we will, like I said, it's the boomerizing of our generation. We will age out and not understand the alienation that the next generation feels because we have memories that they don't. We have defaults that can't be taken away from us. But that's also, I think, again, the idea of like defining exactly where these front lines are. I'm sorry to I don't want to leave things on a negative note, but it's more that, and I haven't talked that much about the specifics of the tools, but maybe we can get into those things when we have, I want to give some time where people can give their thoughts and also to discuss these things. But I wanted just to introduce these ideas as potentially some of the consequences or spaces or impacts that might be thought of when we imagine what these tools look like when they're in the hands of platform models, which are currently content hosting and are about to potentially become infinitely content generating. Thank you very much. I see there's a lot of questions in the chat. Zach, Vera, do you want to select some, or I don't know how you want to do this?
Yeah, we can do it like this. First, everyone, please give a big applause to David. You can also do it with this little emoji. Yeah, that was so interesting and really nice. And actually, I think it's good to end, or like it's a good point where you ended it, because it's also an open thing, right? We don't know what will happen, but it's just such an insightful observation of what could happen. So thank you so much for that. So what we can do is I can go through the questions. Like if you didn't do it yet and you have a question, please post it in the chat. I saw one question by Paul Bailey, who said, thank you for the provocation, David. Wouldn't or couldn't you still have the impulse to share those bespoke feeds of content though, and therefore build or cultivate a community or a culture? So I guess it's like, yeah, sorry.
Thank you, Paul. I think that in part, we're even in this conversation, we've logged onto this Zoom because I think for a lot of us, our instinct is that we are interested in the idea of culture being shared. And we're curious about the culture that other people make, or some people have tuned in maybe because you're giving me your time to hear my perspective on this. I think the thing which I guess concerns me, and I'm curious to what extent this mirrors other people's experiences, is that in the last 5 or 6 years, with the emergence of some very, very powerful monopolistic platform actors, increasingly the spaces in which we would share let's say we get something really wonderful in our Spotify feed that we want to share with friends, the capacity to put that into spaces that we previously would have considered public, I think has diminished greatly over the last decade or so and is narrowing fast. Even like a social media platform like Twitter, for example, seems like it's existentially threatened by its current owner, but also that the idea of that public content there is valuable to the extent to which you can share, as opposed to the feed essentially being a monetization tool for placing paid content into, or encouraging the user to become like a paid user rather than a public, that this is accessed as just a utility rather than a service, is clearly, that's on the back foot. I would love to see those models of the open internet defended. I think it's less to do with the instincts of the user and more to do with the tools that are available to us. I believe our instincts are pro-social. We are, as an organism, hardwired to communicate. What is interesting is that I think we have tolerated a massive narrowing of the public sphere in the last 10 years with very little pushback or articulation as to what that has done to our rights or our fundamental norms or defaults of communication. If that continues, I worry we'll cross certain tipping points whereby these things will essentially become esoteric rock pools within culture. We think about this a lot in the studio in the sense that, yeah, I can share it in the group chat. I can share it with my 5 mates. But then the danger is actually I become even more disempowered as a social actor because nothing I'm doing is achieving either permanency or wider cultural currency. It's making me more different from people in a different group chat who are having different experiences there. We have the inherent fracturing and tribalization that comes with a change to the platform. Even though our instinct is pro-social, that we're sharing content, it's actually creating more social division as a result.
Interesting. Thank you. That's such a good answer. So it has almost a polarizing effect. And there's a question by Kim Cordova that kind of ties into that, but on a larger scale. And she asks, David, how do you think this solipsism will manifest on the level of societies or even the relationship between countries? What would this do to national identity and diplomacy?
I think that one of the things which has defined the last 20 years of like global politics is the emergence through the persistent digital space of the feed of a parallel environment to the topos of physical interpersonal reality and spaces that was previously wholly and completely the political terrain of the state actor, the government that could define the laws of interpersonal relationships in that space, permitted speech, could deprive or endow privileges to individuals. And you've seen through it getting essentially outflanked or surprised or sandbagged by the emergence of the internet, which state actors didn't understand or didn't prepare wholly for. The emergence essentially, and I've talked about this, if anyone's interested in this idea, on a podcast I did with Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst called Interdependence, where I talked about a conflict that I referred to as a conflict of primacy, which I think defines a lot of the politics of our age, which is that the traditional world and traditional states and traditional even attitudes to assets, real estate, the ownership of land, the ability to restrict movement, the ability to even own big walls that you could put big pieces of art on, which gave them physical value. This is all a single order of value and political power, which derives from the physical terrain and our need to navigate and live within it and perform identity within it in our lives. Within digital space, a lot of those norms and defaults can be circumvented. People can have identities in digital space they find to be more true to their idea of self or more real than they have that which is conferred upon them by physical society. And they find this very liberating, but it draws them again towards the idea that their digital self is the self which they consider their norm. Through cryptocurrency and certain like decentralized forms of the financial ledger, people can have entire economies online where they can access both the tools or the experiences that they want, which are wholly and separately excluded from any input into the physical state system. They can try and use methods of banking or currency transfer, which again are extra legal or extra state. And again, it's, I think, creates the potential for the emergence of an entirely new personal ideology, that which I would call the digital prime individual. Previously, prior to this, to the emergence of a persistent virtual realm, everyone was physical prime. Power was manifest in the physical realm. Identity was manifest in the physical realm. It is now technically possible for the first time for someone to be digital prime, to see both their self, their means of income, their identity, their community, their values, nationality, spirituality as entirely being accessed through digital means that they believe they have the right to circumvent the state, that the state does not control or should not operate. I think that this conflict plays out and has played out on a larger scale within the last 20 years of politics. The emergence of what we see as populist actors who operate outside the state system are merely those who've been able to manipulate these concerns or I'd say in many ways, on the far left and the far right, exactly the same promise that comes from this space of a certain entitlement, the entitlement to be free from the responsibility for one's physical reality to determine the primary realities of one's life. And so you ask to be exempt from certain laws, you demand to be exempt from certain responsibilities, you no longer want to contribute to a state that you don't believe provides for you in a fundamental way. And this has been exploited by all kinds of nefarious actors, again, across the political spectrum, who are tapping into this latent political discontent. I think this front line will only widen further when, through the possibility of these services, which I would call digital solipsism, one can actually manifest a far more compelling, persistent, illusory reality or digital reality, which again could be more attractive, could feel like it's more nourishing, could feel like it's more reflective of your own identity. It will certainly be algorithmically strongly driven by your digital identity, because all of its inputs will be your digital inputs. That will only lead to a more, I think, dangerous polarization, not person to person, it will be that polarization too, but also between those who place some value on the idea that these physical relationships, physical services, physical utilities, physical responsibilities, even physical laws should be maintained by default, and those who believe that we should seek means to emancipate ourselves from them, not just in a kind of like transhumanist cybernetic sense, but in a much more boring, banal, soupy, gruely Spotify sense. I think that's the thing that like needs to be like thrown back at Nick Land and the CCRU, that it's very seductive to talk about these things as like farewell to the flesh. But what if it's literally just like kind of welcome Spotify? Because really our ability to manifest the answers to a lot of these questions, like I said, with these tools, I can create individual content without anywhere to share that content. That content is essentially fantastical. I don't want to say masturbatory, but you know, it's a very small loop of dialogue. What I find nourishing is the space in which that becomes something which is giving the broadest value possible to a community, allowing them the utility of that value for the longest possible period of time. And in order to do that, I believe that attention needs to be paid to the very boring, very lame, very trad systems that maintain the abidance of communication within the public sphere. Literally like super boring publishing models, public transport models that place people who have similar lives in similar spaces that make them spaces of public communication, like literally the public square. I mean, we can go right back to like the 18th and 19th century, like the Malthusian like idea of where public life takes place, and that deprive people of these things, and suddenly the arguments of Spotify and the arguments of digital prime become much more seductive. Because what are you can simultaneously make the nourishing, rich content space of community life worse by just depriving people of access to the actual content which makes that worthwhile, while manifesting something which is entirely solipsistic and more seductive at the same time, because it is the only content that you can access. It's definitely coming, right? We're going to see like kind of like neural filter remixes on Netflix, I imagine will be very, very soon, right? Where you can choose to watch the movie in the style of a manga or a style of a cartoon that you like, rather than you can watch The Departed, but it's an anime. Like there'll be drop downs on this. And again, the things which we had an ick factor about, like the bold glamour filter on TikTok, which, you know, like I think 3 years ago, if you described it, it would be even like 3 years ago, is maybe optimistic, like it would have felt strongly dystopian. But now for most people, it's like, this is just, it's a sensible default for a space in which appearance is a huge part of the currency of attention. So making this tool available to users makes sense within the kind of cultural model, language model the space propagates. Similar as well, if we view Spotify or Netflix as just like a never-ending attention tar pit, and the goal is to flatter as specific as possible the tastes or fantasies of the user, rather than to create content with shareable cultural value, then why not introduce neural filters to the content? Who gives a shit how Scorsese wanted The Departed to look? If you want to watch an anime and there are only like, you know, they can make as many synthetic animes as they want, but why don't they just say like, well, you know, this user loves anime. Do you want to watch Anime Departed? Obviously, some directors are going to pull their content from there, but some might not. And they'll synthesize the rest. Anyway, sorry, Kim, very long answer. And the point is as well, I think it's fair to say that like the political and social impacts of this are very complex, but I think we are already living in the world where many of the precursors to what create these political front lines already defines our reality. We already have political actors that are dominated by exploiting and manipulating what are essentially the solipsistic environment. Facebook was like kind of the original solipsism engine, right? Like it would just generate political ideas essentially, not sui generis through a language model, but it would just source content from the hundreds and hundreds of millions of monkeys on the typewriter that was Facebook users, creating their like ranting own insights into the world, and simply algorithmically push that which created the most like kind of useful friction from viewer attention. It's not going to be hard to create that content with language models either. Yeah, I think when we were talking about 15 years ago that Facebook was going to eat democracy, I think it was like laughable to a lot of people then. But the idea that what Facebook is very straightforward. It's a replacement for the public sphere. It's a replacement for the space in which you would have normally encountered opinion. And you would have also encountered other people who naturally, in a kind of backed in social sense, like you would have seen their faces, you would have understood their social context, you would have even sensed their emotion. Now you just encounter their opinions divorced from the body. And the opinion without organs is a very dangerous construct in contemporary society.
Thank you so much. It's so interesting. There's a lot more questions, but we're already running out of time. But yeah, it's really interesting to hear you about this and to see like, yeah, your views on it, and also to like kind of see in the chat. I hope you had the time to also scroll through that a little bit.
Can we do one more, or is it, if it's totally over?
Yeah, I think we can do one more. I think
I don't want to.
Yeah.
I just feel like I want to give more people a chance to.
Yeah.
People. I don't know if they can get the mic, like, but let's see. Go on. Is there? Yeah, Vera, you pick.
I think maybe so. There's a few more questions. I think maybe we can pull it back to creative practice a little bit. Maybe I'm wondering if you have thoughts on what artists and designers can do in this sphere. Like what are maybe ways that we should respond or approach this problem? I think that might be a good closing question.
So I use language model image synthesis in our practice here. I use, we work in I think there are people almost certainly in this conversation far more advanced or operating at an engineering level than we use it in a very like consumer level, where we use Midjourney, we use Stable Diffusion in the studio. There is no question, and what I don't want to be is critical of these tools, which in and of themselves, I think, offer tremendous potential that I hope that we can generate the context where we can realize some of that potential in a way that is shared, because they can empower bad actors, as I've said, on a macro level. But I think there are two things which I'd like to draw attention to really quickly, which I think these tools create, I think, a very interesting kind of component of contemporary workflow, which is these tools are very good for visualization, if it's a language model, image synthesis model, and also for translating sketches into things which are more realized, rather than a replacement for the labor of the artist, where it's like, hey, look, I can paint this painting really well. Before I couldn't, but the AI did it for me. Instead, I think you can view that as a communication tool where you can realize in a way that for the audience is more intelligible and gripping and consistent concepts that might have been quite arcane or outre or difficult to otherwise communicate. So the storyboards for films, the concepting for potential environments, or like even like kind of social scenarios for visual conditions which might be manifest. And as designers, I think the ability for us to communicate those to people perhaps who are not visual first in their practice, and so when they see a sketch, it's not easy for them to picture it, is, I think, a non-negligible thing which can potentially help for very quickly ideas which might have been otherwise difficult to consider or countenance to be put into effect. And again, I don't want to stereotype anyone, but sometimes you encounter organizations on a creative level where the people who will be responsible for making a decision are not visual first people themselves. And the more that you can make them feel like they understand the impact of an idea that might have been very difficult, just very novel or very, doesn't have an existing precedent in the world. So I can't just pull up a mood board and say, we want to go in this direction. And mood boards are a whole other thing. But what I would hope is, rather than this being a plagiarism engine, it's actually a chance for us to move outside of the idea that in order to at first communicate concepts, we have to plagiarize other people's work to show a concept. And that actually no one can get an idea approved that doesn't already have an extant example in the world of like a finished success model. If you can show something to a non-visually native person which to them appears like a simulacrum or an understanding of the impact the finished thing might have, and you say, now we want to build this, like we don't want to use the output of Midjourney as the thing, now we want to actually go and make this, then I think it's easier to have that conversation. I think that's actually really liberating for potentially for both creators and for the people on the other side of that conversation. It can make them feel much more actually like they understand the process that you're embarking upon. And if used, obviously it still takes skill to do it thoughtfully and to do it well, but that's, I think, really, really important. And the second thing as well is, again, to say that, like, disabuse yourself of the notion that any product of these tools, no matter how ridiculously advanced they are compared to what existed 6 months ago, is in and of itself permanently interesting and advanced. What looks remarkable to us today will be completely quotidian and backward tomorrow. And that's very much the case with these, something which is going to be driven by Moore's law rather than how fast we can learn to draw it. And to instead to try and focus where possible, as I think we try and remind ourselves with the practice at Terrain, on what are the fundamentals of a communication system which will continue to be experienced over time. And therefore, what are the values that we can put into the core experience here which are worth manifesting? The fact that these tools can help us get to those values at a scale or a volume that previously was impossible, at a speed that was previously impossible, can be a remarkable benefit if the goals are still to create something which is rich, nourishing, communal, distributed and useful to an audience of as many people for as long as it possibly can. And I guess I would say that's where I guess I'd like to try and leave the optimistic focus of the conversation.
Thanks so much, David. Please, one more applause for David. Thank you so much. That was really, really great. I wish we had more time. But yeah, I think we need to end the lecture here. Thank you so much. It was so interesting. And this is also the end of our lecture series about generative AI and artistic practice, which feels a bit soon. Honestly, I don't think we have all the answers yet. But we're interested in hearing what you're interested about and like what things you would like us to approach in the next lecture series. So we made this poll where you can vote on stuff. You can also add stuff in the chat. We're very grateful for everyone that joined this, and especially David that blew our minds today. I think I'll leave it at that, and I'll give the word to Zach to summarize.
Yeah, just thanks again to everybody for coming and being a part of this series. And thanks to David for the excellent talk today. And then a huge round of applause for Vera for organizing this and being a really gracious host. Just want to say, if you have ideas for us, we love doing this series and we're happy to do more of them. So if there are topics or areas that you think you want us to explore, we're all ears for that. And again, thanks everybody for coming.